Welcome back to the Morning Kickoff Show. I'm your host, Matt Witt, and today we're here to talk about the Minnesota Vikings 2019 draft class and what happened to these 12 players. Yes, that's 12 players from the 2019 draft class. Looking at this, we often talk about how great the 2020 draft class is, or how great the 2015 draft class is, which, in my opinion, was the best Vikings draft class of all time. We rarely talk about the draft classes that were just a dumpster fire, which is exactly what the 2019 draft class was for the Minnesota Vikings, where we had a first round bust, half the players drafted in this draft class are no longer with the team and expected to be more than half by the start of this upcoming season, zero Pro Bowlers, zero All Pros, and multiple busts. We're going to be talking about this because there was only a few players who actually exceeded their draft pick, which is not seen very often for the Vikings because Vikings are great at drafting often or are great at drafting and developing their players, but you're going to notice a trend amongst this list. Vikings are terrible at drafting and developing offensive linemen. And that's why we're going to have multiple offensive linemen from this 2019 draft class who have just been terrible on this Vikings offensive line. And we're going to start it off with a big one, Garrett Bradbury. The Vikings drafted Bradbury with the 18th overall pick in 2019 out of NC State. Bradbury was expected to be our next core offensive line starter and our next franchise offensive line center. Well, now looking at it, 3 years into his career, we can actually write him down as a bust. And I give this draft pick a grade of a D. And the only reason why he's a D, and that seems a little high for an 18th overall draft pick, is because for once, I'm not going to put players at an F unless if they've been already cut or released from the team. I just don't think it's right to give Garrett Bradbury an F quite yet because we will see him play another year under center for the Minnesota Vikings, or at center for the Minnesota Vikings. It's unlikely, very unlikely, that he does get cut from the team. And the only reason why I don't put him at a D minus is because he has done a respectful job blocking for Dalvin Cook. I mean, Dalvin Cook last 3 seasons has gotten over 1,000 rushing yards. A lot of Dalvin Cook's runs, Garrett Bradbury was a key part in blocking. For that, I mean, looking at it all in all, we all know how terrible he's done at pass protection and how much he's been owned by his opposing defensive linemen. I mean, Garrett Bradbury, we can write him down as a bust already for the Vikings. It's very unlikely that he comes back from the team. We didn't approve his 5th-year option, and it's very unlikely we give him another contract. Going into the second round with the 50th overall draft pick, the Minnesota Vikings drafted Irv Smith Jr. out of Alabama. At the day of this draft pick, I absolutely loved this draft pick. As of right now, looking 3 years into his career, I give this draft pick, as of right now, a C minus. The thing about Irv Smith Jr., although he's been great when he was on the field, over the first 3 years in his career has only started 14 games in the NFL thus far. And those 14 games came in his first 2 seasons, missed the entire last year due to his torn meniscus. Looking at this right now, it's safe to say that this was not the right draft pick. Although Irv Smith Jr. can still work in the league, I'm not saying he's not going to work. We're going to get to see him start at tight end this next season. The pick right after him at 51st overall was A.J. Brown. A few picks after that was DK Metcalf. We saw Terry McLaurin go in the 3rd round. There's multiple better offensive players for the Vikings who we could have taken. Now, Irv Smith Jr., though, still, I think he's going to be great in the league. It's just we haven't seen it yet, so we can't say that this was a good draft pick quite yet. I'm very excited to see what he can do this next season as he's still incredibly young. He was the youngest player from the 2019 draft class. And I believe that he still will work in the league. It's just we haven't seen it yet. So that's what I'm hoping going into year 4 for Irv Smith Jr. Next up in the 3rd round, one of the few players who actually exceeded their draft pick was Alexander Madison, who was drafted 102nd overall from Boise State. Over the first 3 years of Madison's career, he's been one of the best backup running backs in all of football, backing up one of the best running backs in all of football. So the Vikings have built, in my opinion, a top 3 running back duo. You can argue best running back duo in all of football. And I give this pick a B plus for the Minnesota Vikings. I see a lot of people talking about trading away Dalvin Cook and sticking with Alexander Madison. In my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, you can argue both sides, I get this. Alexander Madison's the most overrated player on this Vikings roster. Because looking at him as a backup running back has done an excellent job. Looking at him as a starting running back doesn't look like starting running back caliber talent quite yet. Looking at the 6 games that he started, let's take a look at the real defenses that he played. Over his 6 starts, half of those defenses that he's won against was the Detroit Lions. 3 out of 6 of his starts was the Detroit Lions defense. Those games, those are stat games for running backs because that's one of the worst run-stopping defenses in all of football. Another 1.5 games that he started was against the Seattle Seahawks, who over the last 2 years have been one of the worst run-stopping defenses. And then he started against the Atlanta Falcons, another not so great run-stopping defense, and only a 2.6 yard per carry. He started against the Rams, one of the best run stopping defenses, and only had 3.1 yards per carry. In case you don't know numbers, that's not good when you're a starting running back. And Dalvin Cook is light years better than Madison. And I would expect that the Vikings trade Madison by the deadline or he doesn't return with the team. I don't think Madison will come back on the Vikings for another contract. And I don't think he should. Going on to the fourth round, we have another offensive lineman who has been a massive bust. Drew Samia. Drew Samia was drafted in the fourth round, 114th overall from Oklahoma, and this grade is obviously an F. Drew Samia has been nothing but a dumpster fire on this Vikings offensive line, started 4 games in 2020, and was cut after the 2020 season by the start of the 2021 regular season. So just playing 2 years in his career was already released from the team because he was nothing but terrible, and looking at it right now, he is looking to revive his career with the New York Jets. He's backing up Elijah Vera Tucker and Laken Tomlinson. That's a tough duo right there. It's going to be hard for him to win a starting role with New York, but maybe we do get to see him step in as a rotational guy. I still expect Drew Samia going to be an okay starting or okay backup guard somewhere. Thing is, like the Vikings, it's just we aren't great at developing offensive linemen. Let's be honest. Look at the history with this team. This is not going to be the last offensive lineman we see on this list. Spoiler alert. Next up, we have Cameron Smith, linebacker, drafted in the 5th round with the 162nd overall draft pick from USC. I'm going to ask a lot of you guys who aren't diehard Vikings fans. I'm assuming a lot of you who tune into the show are diehard Vikings fans, but the casuals don't even know who Cameron Smith is. That's a perfect example of the 2019 draft class, where he drafted someone in the 5th round who played a little bit in his rookie season. He did get some snaps his rookie season, showed some promise. Second year, sat out the season. I believe he had open heart surgery, so respectfully sat out his next season, and then retired after his second season, which came by an absolute surprise. I mean, Cameron Smith, obviously being as young as he is and looking like he should continue to play football, retired after his second season. That was a slap in the face to me because I expected this player to be a lot better than he was. Still, another F. Another player is no longer with the team. Going on to our next draft pick, Arden Watts, who in my opinion, hands down, the best draft pick out of this 2019 draft class. And I would argue the best player out of this 2019 draft class. And we took him in the 6th round, 190th overall pick from Arkansas. And I argue that our 6th round draft pick exceeds the other draft picks that we've just talked about. Now, obviously, we have to see more from Irv Smith Jr. and Alexander Madison still is an absolute stud. But Arden Watts has been secretly a pleasant surprise on this Vikings defense as he's been 100% healthy over the last few seasons. And with that opportunity of him being a rotational guy has been nothing but elite. And now going into year 4 for Arden Watts, we could see him win the starting role going into year 4 as a 6th round draft pick and could be a starter. Last year, he started 9 games where he had 2 forced fumbled, 5 sacks, and 46 total tackles in just 9 starts. Yeah, that's incredible for a defensive lineman that was drafted in the 6th round. I believe this guy fits perfectly into Ed Donatell's defense and honestly could be a starter going into year 4. I would love to see this guy starting on this defensive line with Harrison Phillips and Dalvin Tomlinson, just massive defensive linemen. I absolutely love this guy, and I appreciate Arden Watts to death, and is one of the only great draft picks out of this draft class, and that's the reason why he's the only player who's going to get an A from this draft class. And then next up, we have safety Marcus Epps, who we drafted in the 6th round with the 191st overall draft pick from Wyoming. This grade is obviously an F because Marcus Epps really never got an opportunity with the Vikings. We cut him his rookie season, was immediately picked up by the Philadelphia Eagles, and so far has seen massive success in Philadelphia. So yeah, the player who's been the best from this draft class wasn't even the best on our roster. He's been the best. He's the start. He's listed as a starter now for Philadelphia, and is now going to be a starting center or safety alongside Anthony Harris, or at least is expected to be. That's not confirmed, but he is expected to be a starting safety this next season. In 2021, he started 3 games, 62 total tackles, 5 pass deflections, an interception, and a 72.8 PFF grade. I mean, I'm happy for him. As much as I don't like Philadelphia, I'm still happy for Marcus Epps that he's able to work with Philadelphia because the Vikings never gave him a true shot. Terrible draft pick, but a great player. Next up, Oli Udoh, another offensive lineman. Drafted in the 6th round, 193rd overall from Elon. This grade is a D-. The only reason why he's not an F is because he still has an opportunity to prove himself as a backup right tackle. With that being said, D- because he's been terrible, and I don't think he's going to make the roster this upcoming season. Oli Udo started 16 games in 2021. He was our starter last year at right guard, where he led the NFL with 16 penalties. Oli penalty machine Udo was an absolute dumpster fire on this offensive line this last year. And looking at the interior offensive line as general has just been so bad with Bradbury, Udo, Drew Samia. We had Pat Elflein a couple years ago, Dakota Dozier. I mean, our interior offensive linemen are just god awful. And Oli Udo, you can add him to the list. He only allowed one sack last year, too, which is incredible. I mean, the only reason why he only allowed one sack was because he held on for dear life. I guess when you hold on to all of your players and you get 16 penalties, it helps you when you're looking at how many sacks he allowed. But unlikely to make the roster this upcoming season, so I have him at a D-, another player we failed to develop. And then next up, we have a loved player on this Vikings team, a loved player for no reason, and that is Chris Boyd, who is cornerback drafted in the 7th round with the 217th overall draft pick from Texas. I give this grade a D just simply because I don't think he's going to make this upcoming roster. Now, he was drafted in the 7th round. He made the roster, I believe, all years up to this point, and he's done great on special teams. So up to this point, I'm not saying that he was a terrible player. It's just as a corner, has done nothing for this team. I mean, the one great play I can think that he made was this last year where he tackled the guy for a loss. I believe it was on 3rd down, and then taunted, and it ended up ruining the play that he just made because he taunted and gave the team a 1st down. I don't know any other great plays that he's made in the regular season other than that. I mean, Chris Boyd has really done nothing for this team. And after drafting Andrew Booth and a Caleb Evans and bringing in Chandon Sullivan, and you brought Patrick Peterson back, I don't think Chris Boyd's going to be in this roster this next year. Again, he still has time to prove himself. I love the guy. I think he's a great dude. That aside, looking at his performance on the field, hasn't done great as a corner. Now, he's an excellent tackler. So maybe he does work. Maybe he does work as a nickel. We'll have to see with Chris Boyd. It's going to be interesting because I think he is a great tackler. It's just when it comes down to coverage, has a lot to work on. For that reason, I give this grade a D because I don't think he's going to make the roster. Next up, another 7th round draft pick. The Vikings had 4 draft picks in the 7th round, and the worst one was Dillon Mitchell, wide receiver, drafted in the 7th round with the 239th overall draft pick from Oregon. Dillon Mitchell never played a single snap on the Vikings roster, was cut by the team. He was never actually on the active roster. He played in the practice squad his first year, was cut by the team after that, never was signed with another team, an absolute bust. Nothing else to say there. But right after that, we drafted Olabisi Johnson, another wide receiver, this time with the 247th overall draft pick from Colorado State. Unlike Dillon Mitchell, BC Johnson has played all years up to this point, other than last year where he tore his ACL. But I give this grade a B because he's been a great wide receiver. Looking at him, when he's drafted in the 7th round and you've made the roster over your first few years as a wide receiver and at least held your own, earned your roster spot, unlike Chris Boyd where we needed another corner on the roster, BC Johnson has actually earned his roster spot. I give him a B because he's done a great job as a rotational guy. Obviously, as a rookie, was outstanding stepping in for Adam Thielen. Going into year 2, he started alongside Adam Thielen, and then Justin Jefferson just took the league by a storm and then missed the whole last season due to a torn ACL, so that kind of drops his draft grade a little bit. But still, going into year 4, should make the roster. I don't think there's any question about this. BC Johnson should be our wide receiver 4 or wide receiver 5 now, and it's going to be interesting to see how Kevin O'Connell does plan to use BC Johnson going into year 4. Respect this guy. So happy he's on a roster, and again, I think he can work as a slot receiver. Maybe sometime in the future he's going to be a starter. Maybe with the Vikings, maybe not. And then we have the dumbest draft pick of all time for the Minnesota Vikings, drafting Austin Cutting in the 7th round, 250th overall draft pick from the Air Force. That's a long snapper the Vikings drafted. In my opinion, I believe there's 2 rules, unwritten rules, when it comes to drafting. Number 1, don't draft a running back in the 1st round. Unless if it's one piece away from winning a Super Bowl, don't draft a running back in the 1st round. Number 2, don't draft a long snapper, period. I mean, I don't understand why the Vikings decided to draft a long snapper. This is the only long snapper the Vikings have drafted in history, and that's because why would you ever want to draft a long snapper? I give this grade an F simply because, obviously, the guy played 1 year with Minnesota and then was cut, I believe, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, is anybody surprised about that? You're drafting a long snapper. You're supposed to change out your long snappers because there's a million of them that went undrafted. I know it's the 250th overall draft pick. That's only a few before the final draft pick. At least try. Why draft a long snapper? I mean, who does that? Who does that? Mike Zimmer does that. Rick Spielman does that. I don't think we're ever going to see another long snapper drafted by the Vikings. And in my personal opinion, a lot of these players aren't going to sign another contract with the team. Half the players from this list are no longer with the team, and the other half from this list are likely not going to be returning with the team. So looking at the 2019 draft class, this will go down as one of the worst in Vikings history. We saw a few players shine. Other than that, it's not even comparable to multiple draft classes that the Vikings have done. I want to put this draft class aside and say the Vikings are one of the best teams at drafting players and developing them. Looking at offensive linemen, you see a trend amongst these players with Garrett Bradbury, with Drew Samia, with Oli Udo. We all got to see these players start, and we all got to see how terrible they were. Hopefully, this new regime coming in can change the narrative that the Vikings can't draft and develop offensive linemen. Hopefully, this does change with Ed Ingram and Ezra Cleveland and Christian Darrisaw's development going into this next regime. So that wraps up the 2019 draft class for the Minnesota Vikings. A lot of players who were just fell apart in the league. You saw a first round bust. Half the players are no longer with the team going into year 4. Still, all these players are on contract year. Irv Smith Jr. can ball out next season. I mean, for all we know, we could see Arden Watts be the starter and turn into a star this next year. I'm still excited. A lot of these players still have to prove themselves as a starter, still have to prove themselves in the league, but most of it has been terrible. Let me know what y'all think.